The clock on the precinct wall ticked relentlessly as Detective Akira Tanaka pored over the case files. 4 months, 4 victims, and a city gripped by fear. Each body discovered in a different abandoned building, posed with an unsettling artistry, cause of death unknown. Her partner, Detective Zain Mirza, entered the room, his face grim. "Forensics just called. They've found something." Akira looked up, a spark of hope in her eyes. "What is it?" "They wouldn't say over the phone. We need to go to the lab. Now." As they drove through the quiet streets, Akira's mind raced. This case had consumed her life, haunting her waking hours and invading her dreams. The victims seemed to have nothing in common: different ages, backgrounds, professions. Yet something or someone had connected their fates in this macabre tableau. The forensics lab was a hive of activity despite the late hour. Dr. Rin Chen, the lead forensic analyst, met them at the door, her usually calm demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement. "You need to see this," she said, leading them to her workstation. On the screen was an image that made both detectives pause. It was a microscopic view of a skin sample from the latest victim. But something was off. Amidst the normal cellular structure were tiny metallic objects, glinting under the electron microscope. "What are we looking at?" Zain asked, leaning in for a closer look. Dr. Chen's voice was hushed, as if she could hardly believe her own words. "Nanobots, thousands of them, and they're still active." Akira felt a chill run down her spine. This case had just taken a turn into territory she never expected. As she stared at the screen, one thought echoed in her mind. Who could be behind this, and what were they trying to achieve? Akira's mind raced as she processed the implications of Dr. Chen's discovery. Active nanobots? In a dead body? How is that possible? Dr. Chen shook her head, her eyes never leaving the screen. "I don't know. By all rights, they should have shut down when the host died. But they're not just active, they're evolving." Zain leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. "Evolving? What do you mean?" "Watch," Dr. Chen said, tapping a few keys. The image on the screen began to move, showing a time-lapse of the nanobots over the past few hours. The tiny machines were indeed changing, reconfiguring themselves into increasingly complex structures. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Chen continued. "I've never seen anything like it. It's as if they're adapting to their environment, even without a living host." Akira felt a chill run down her spine. Could these nanobots be responsible for the deaths? "It's possible," Dr. Chen replied, "but that raises more questions than it answers. Who created them? How did they get into the victims? And why can't we find any injection sites or other means of introduction?" Zane's phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. His face paled as he read the message. "We've got another one. Body found in an abandoned church on the outskirts of town." Akira nodded grimly. "We need to go. Dr. Chen, can you keep analyzing these nanobots? And please keep this under wraps for now. If word gets out—" "I understand," Dr. Chen said. "I'll keep you updated on any developments." As they drove to the new crime scene, Akira's mind was in turmoil. Nanobots that could survive and evolve after their host's death? It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. Yet the evidence was right there, under Dr. Chen's microscope. The abandoned church loomed before them, its spire a dark silhouette against the night sky. As they approached, Akira couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger and more dangerous than they had ever encountered before. Inside, the scene was hauntingly familiar. The body was posed in the center of the nave, arms outstretched as if in supplication. The victim's face wore the same serene expression they had seen 4 times before. As Akira surveyed the scene, something caught her eye. There, on the victim's neck, was a tiny mark she hadn't noticed on the previous bodies. She leaned in for a closer look. "Zain," she called, her voice tight. Look at this! Her partner joined her, squinting at the mark. It was barely visible, but under their flashlights they could make out a tiny symbol etched into the skin, a stylized hourglass. What do you think it means? Zane asked. Akira shook her head slowly. I don't know, but I have a feeling we're running out of time to figure it out. As the forensics team began their work, Akira stood back, her mind racing. Nanobots, evolving machines, mysterious symbols. The pieces were there, but she couldn't see how they fit together. Not yet. One thing was certain. This case was far from over. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Akira Tanaka knew that she was standing on the precipice of a mystery that could change everything. As the forensics team continued their meticulous work, Akira stepped outside the church, needing a moment to clear her head. The cool morning air did little to calm her racing thoughts. She pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a number she hadn't used in years. Hello? A groggy voice answered. Dr. Yamamoto, it's Akira Tanaka. I'm sorry to wake you, but I need your expertise. There was a pause on the other end. Detective Tanaka, it's been a while. What's this about? Akira took a deep breath. Nanobots. Active, evolving nanobots found in dead bodies. Does this sound like something you've encountered before? The silence that followed was deafening. When Dr. Yamamoto spoke again, his voice was tense. Where are you? We shouldn't discuss this over the phone. An hour later, Akira and Zane were seated in Dr. Yamamoto's cluttered office at the university. The aging scientist paced back and forth, his face a mask of concern. What you're describing, he said, sounds remarkably similar to a project I worked on years ago, a top-secret government initiative called Project Lazarus. Zane leaned forward. Project Lazarus? What was its purpose? Dr. Yamamoto sighed. To cheat death itself. The idea was to create nanobots that could repair cellular damage, fight disease, even restart a stopped heart. But the project was shut down when we couldn't control the nanobots' evolution. They became unpredictable. Akira felt a chill run down her spine. And now they're showing up in dead bodies across the city. How is this possible? I don't know, Dr. Yamamoto admitted. All our research was supposedly destroyed. But if someone got their hands on it, if they've managed to restart the project... He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air. As they left the university, Akira's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen. You need to see this. Come to the lab immediately. At the lab, Dr. Chen's face was pale as she showed them her latest findings. The nanobots, she said. They're not just evolving. They're communicating with each other across different hosts. What are you saying? Zane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chen's hands shook slightly as she pulled up a new image on her screen. It showed a complex network of signals passing between the nanobots and different victims. It's like they're forming a hive mind, she explained. And there's more. Look at this. The great houses of Chaco Canyon stood like sentinels in the moonlight. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the structures, was a maze of stone walls and empty windows. As I walked through the ancient city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pulled out the receipt I'd found at Sam's gas station and studied the address again. The construction site should be just beyond the protected area of the park. As I hiked in that direction, I noticed something odd. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading off the main road and into a narrow canyon. Following the tracks, I soon came upon a makeshift camp. Construction equipment sat idle in the moonlight, and a few temporary buildings had been set up. But something was wrong. The camp was deserted, and there were signs of a struggle. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, and... was that blood on the ground? My heart raced as I investigated further. In one of the buildings, I found a stack of documents. Plans for a resort complex, environmental impact studies, and my blood ran cold. There was a map of the canyon with certain areas marked in red. One of them corresponded to where Sam's gas station had been. Suddenly, a low growl broke the silence. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the edge of the camp, stood the creature. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. In the moonlight, I could see that its fur was patchy, revealing leathery skin underneath. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The creature took a step forward, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the earth. Then, to my horror, it began to change. Its form shifted and twisted, becoming more humanoid. Within moments, a man stood where the beast had been, but his eyes were still those of the creature. "You should not have come here, Darren Redhorse," the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The man, or creature, I wasn't sure what to call it anymore, took another step towards me. "How do you know my name?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The being tilted its head, a gesture that was disturbingly inhuman despite its now human form. "I know many things, Darren. I have watched your people for centuries. I have protected these lands since before your ancestors first set foot here." My mind reeled. This shapeshifter, was claiming to be some kind of ancient guardian? "Protected?" I spat out. "You killed Sam. You've been terrorizing people." A look of what might have been sadness crossed the being's face. Samuel Begay was an unfortunate necessity. He discovered something he should not have. As for the others, I do what I must to keep the ancient powers contained. I glanced at the documents I'd found. What does this construction have to do with it? Why are you attacking these sites? The being's eyes flashed, a hint of its bestial nature showing through. The fools who would build here do not understand what they are disturbing. Beneath this land lie forces beyond their comprehension. The great houses, the kivas, they were not just dwellings and ceremonial sites. They were prisons, Darren. Prisons for things that should never again walk this earth. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered John Sosie's words about Chaco Canyon being a gateway between worlds. "What kind of things?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. The being's form shimmered, as if it was struggling to maintain its human shape. Gods, demons, creatures from the stars. The names do not matter. What matters is that they remain bound. But the digging, the construction, it weakens the seals. Already some have begun to stir. I thought of the cattle mutilations, the missing people. That was you, trying to stop the construction. The being nodded. I am the last of the guardians, Darren. The old ways are forgotten. The rituals to keep the binding strong lost to time. I do what I can, but I am limited. Limited how? I asked, my fear slowly being replaced by a morbid curiosity. The being's form shimmered again, and for a moment I saw the beast beneath. The price of immortality is high, Darren. To maintain my vigil, I must feed on flesh and fear. It is not a choice I made lightly, but it is necessary. I felt sick. This guardian had been killing people like Sam, to fuel its own existence. But if what it was saying was true, the alternative could be far worse. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. The being's eyes met mine, and I saw the weight of centuries in them. Because you are of the people, Darren. You carry the old blood. And because I am tired, so very tired. As the implications of the guardian's words sank in, I felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on my shoulders. This being, this shapeshifter, had killed my friend. It had terrorized my people for who knows how long. Every instinct told me it was a monster that needed to be stopped. But if what it was saying was true, if it really was the only thing standing between our world and forces of unimaginable horror, what do you want from me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The guardian's form shimmered again, and I caught glimpses of other shapes, a coyote, an eagle, a bear, before it settled back into its human guise. I offer you a choice, Darren Redhorse. Join me, become a guardian. With your help, we can stop this construction, reinforce the bindings, and keep the ancient evils at bay. I stared at the being in disbelief. Become like you? A killer? The guardian shook its head. Not necessarily. The old ways are not entirely lost. With study, with dedication, we might find another way. But it will not be an easy path. You will have to leave your old life behind. I thought of my mother, of the life I'd been trying to build. Could I really give all that up? But then I thought of Sam, of the wider consequences if this being was telling the truth. And if I refuse? I asked. The guardian's eyes hardened. Then I will do what I must, alone. And I cannot promise that your people will be spared in the conflict to come. I closed my eyes, trying to think. Part of me wanted to run, to dismiss this all as the ravings of a monster trying to justify its actions. But deep down, I knew. I knew that what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, was only the tip of something much larger and more terrifying. If I agree, I said slowly, I want your word that no more innocent people will die. We find another way. The guardian nodded solemnly. You have my word, Darren Redhorse. We will seek an alternative path. But know this. The road ahead will be long and fraught with danger. The forces we stand against are patient, but they are also relentless. I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would change my life forever. Then I accept. Teach me. Show me how to be a guardian. A look of relief passed over the being's face, so human in that moment that it was hard to reconcile with the monstrous form I'd seen earlier. Thank you, Darren. You have made a wise choice, though I know it does not feel that way now. As if to emphasize the gravity of the moment, a tremor passed through the earth. In the distance, I heard what sounded like stone grinding against stone. The guardian's head snapped up, its eyes wide with alarm. It's starting. We must hurry. Your training begins now, Darren. Are you ready? I never wanted to be a hero. That's the first thing you should understand about this story. What happened in those woods, what I saw and what I did, none of it came from a desire for adventure or glory. It came from necessity, from survival, and from a lifetime of choices that led me to that moment without my even realizing it. Let me start with why I was there in the first place. My father, Michael Thompson, was a forest ranger in one of Jamaica's largest national parks. He spent his days tracking wildlife, maintaining trails, and keeping poachers at bay. But what he really did, his true calling, was collecting stories. Every village he visited, every old-timer he met, every remote cabin he checked on, they all had tales to tell. Stories about the deep woods, about things that couldn't be explained, about shadows that moved wrong and sounds that shouldn't exist. I grew up on these stories, drinking them in like mother's milk. While other kids my age were watching cartoons and playing video games, I was sitting at our kitchen table, listening to Dad and his ranger friends trade tales over rum and cigarettes. Mom would hover in the background, pretending to be busy with dishes or laundry, but I could see her listening too, her hands still as the stories unfolded. The forest has old magic, Dad would say, his voice dropping low as the night grew deep. Older than the Spanish, older than the Arawaks. Things that were here before people, things that will be here after we're gone. He never said these things during the day, never spoke of them in the harsh light of morning. But at night, with the jungle sounds pressing against our windows and the moon casting strange shadows, Then the truth would come out. I was born small. Still am, really. 5'3" isn't exactly intimidating, especially for someone who spent their childhood dreaming of following in their father's footsteps. But what I lacked in size, I made up for in determination. By age 8, I could identify more local plants than most adults. By 10, I could track animals through the underbrush, reading signs that most people wouldn't even notice. And by 12, I could handle Dad's old double-barrel shotgun like I was born with it in my hands. That last skill came from Uncle Marcus. He wasn't really my uncle. In Jamaica, any close family friend becomes an uncle or aunt eventually. Marcus had served in the military before becoming a ranger alongside my father. He was the one who taught me that the forest wasn't just beautiful, it was dangerous. Beauty and danger, he'd say, watching me practice with the shotgun. They're two sides of the same coin out here. The most beautiful spots are often the most deadly. That's why you need to be ready, always ready. I didn't understand what he meant back then. How could I? I was just a kid playing at being grown up, thinking I knew everything there was to know about the woods, because I could name the trees and track the animals. I didn't understand that there were things in the forest that didn't leave tracks, things that couldn't be named. The weekend everything changed started normally enough. It was October, and I just turned 14 the month before. Dad had promised me a special camping trip for my birthday. Just him, me, Uncle Marcus, and the deep woods. Mom wasn't happy about it. Looking back, I wonder if she knew something was wrong. She'd grown up in these mountains too, after all. Maybe she could sense what was coming. It's too far, she argued the night before we left. That area, people don't go there anymore. It's just stories, Dad assured her, but I noticed he packed extra ammunition anyway. I should have paid more attention to their argument. Should have wondered why Mom, who had never objected to our camping trips before, was so worried about this one. Should have asked why people don't go there anymore. But I was 14 and invincible, and stupid with excitement about finally being allowed to visit the deep woods where Dad's best stories came from. The preparation for the trip was different too, though I didn't realize it at the time. Usually, Dad was casual about our camping gear. We'd throw some supplies in bags, grab the basics, and head out. But this time, he checked everything 3 times. Extra flashlights with fresh batteries, multiple first aid kits, more food than we could possibly eat in a weekend. A satellite phone that I'd never seen him carry before. Uncle Marcus arrived early that Saturday morning, and I immediately noticed something was off. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept. When he hugged me hello, I felt him slip something into my pocket, a small leather pouch that smelled strongly of herbs. "Keep it with you," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't lose it." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but Mom called us in for breakfast and the moment was lost. We ate quickly, Dad and Uncle Marcus exchanging glances that I couldn't interpret. Mom kept finding reasons to delay our departure. One more check of the supplies, one more weather report, one more hug goodbye. Finally, around mid-morning, we loaded up Dad's old truck and headed out. The drive took us away from the tourist areas, away from the beaches and resorts that most people think of when they think of Jamaica. We drove into the real Jamaica, the old Jamaica, where the mountains rise up like the backbone of some ancient beast, and the forests hold secrets older than history. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that barely deserved to be called roads at all. We passed smaller and smaller villages, until even those disappeared. The forest pressed in closer on both sides, the trees growing taller and older the further we went. Uncle Marcus was unusually quiet during the drive, studying an old map that looked like it had been folded and refolded 1,000 times. It wasn't one of the standard ranger maps I was used to seeing. This one was hand-drawn, with annotations in faded ink that I couldn't read. "Where did you get that map?" I asked, leaning forward from the back seat. He quickly folded it away. From an old hunter, someone who knows these woods better than anyone alive. New, Dad corrected quietly. He passed last month. Something in the way they said this made me shiver, despite the warm Caribbean air. It felt like they were talking about more than just a dead hunter. But when I tried to ask more questions, they changed the subject. After about an hour and a half of driving, we reached a point where even the dirt track ended. Dad parked the truck in a small clearing and we started unloading our gear. The forest here felt different from any I'd been in before. The trees were enormous, their trunks wider than our truck, their canopy so thick that only occasional shafts of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was different too, thicker somehow, with an unfamiliar sweetness that made my nose twitch. As we shouldered our packs and started walking, I noticed something else strange. Despite the size and age of the forest, there were very few animal sounds. No birds calling, no monkeys chattering in the trees. Even the usual buzz of insects seemed muted. "Why is it so quiet?" I asked. "Animals know things we don't," Uncle Marcus replied cryptically. "They know when to stay away." I wanted to ask what they were staying away from, but something in his tone made me hold my tongue. Instead, I gripped the strap of my backpack tighter and tried to focus on the path ahead. We hiked for several hours, following what seemed to be an old trail, though it was so overgrown it was barely visible. Uncle Marcus led the way, occasionally consulting his mysterious map. Dad brought up the rear, and I noticed he kept the shotgun in his hands rather than slung over his shoulder as usual. Around mid-afternoon, we came across a stream that cut through the forest like a silver ribbon. The water was crystal clear, running over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. Under normal circumstances, finding such a perfect water source would have been cause for celebration. But when I moved toward it, eager to refill my water bottle, Uncle Marcus grabbed my arm. "Not this one," he said quietly. "We'll find another." I looked at the stream again, and this time I noticed what had made him hesitant. Despite the clear water and perfect location, there were no signs of life around it. No fish darting beneath the surface, no plants growing along its banks. The rocks, while smooth, had an odd color to them, almost like old bone. We moved on, but that stream marked a change in our journey. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing closer together. Their branches began to twist in strange ways, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The sweet smell in the air grew stronger, taking on an undertone of decay that made my stomach turn. By 4:30 p.m., we needed to make camp. The light was already beginning to fade under the thick canopy, and there was an unspoken agreement that we didn't want to be moving after dark. We found a small clearing that seemed suitable, though nothing about it felt right to me. That's when the smell hit us. I've tried many times since then to describe that smell accurately. The closest I can come is to say it was like rotten eggs mixed with spoiled meat and something else. Something older and worse that had no comparison in my experience. It was the kind of smell that seemed to have weight and texture, that made your brain scream wrong on a primitive level. "We should go," I said, but even as the words left my mouth I knew we couldn't. The sun was setting, and we were hours from anywhere that might be considered safe. We were committed now, for better or worse. Dad and Uncle Marcus set up the tents with mechanical efficiency, their movements quick and precise. I noticed they positioned them closer together than usual and arranged them so the entrances faced each other. No one spoke about the smell or about the deep gouges we found in the trees surrounding our campsite, marks that started at least 8 feet up the trunks. The darkness came quickly, dropping over the forest like a heavy blanket. We built a fire, but its light seemed to stop unnaturally short, as if the darkness was pushing back against it. The flames cast jumping shadows that made me think of things moving just beyond our sight. Uncle Marcus pulled out the map again, studying it in the firelight. I managed to catch a glimpse of some of the annotations this time. They weren't in English, or any language I recognized. The symbols looked ancient, like something you'd find carved into cave walls. "What are those markings?" I asked. He folded the map away quickly. "Warnings," he said after a long pause. "The old hunter. He said there were things people needed to know before coming here. Things his grandfather told him, and his grandfather before that." "What kinds of things?" But before he could answer, we heard it. A screech that cut through the night like a knife. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not from any animal I knew. It was high and musical and wrong, like someone had taught metal how to sing. The sound went on and on, until I thought my eardrums would burst. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. Every natural sound had ceased. No insects, no night birds, nothing but the crack and pop of our fire. "Inside," Dad said quietly, picking up the shotgun. "Now." Sleep was impossible, but somehow I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew it was 2 a.m. and my bladder was screaming for relief. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Dad's steady breathing beside me, trying to convince myself I could hold it until morning. That's when I heard the branch snap. It wasn't a small sound, like a squirrel or bird might make. This was the sound of something heavy moving through the forest, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. I clutched the shotgun that Dad had insisted I keep close, my palms sweaty against the wooden stock. Uncle Marcus's scream shattered the night. It came from the other tent, a sound of pure terror that made my blood run cold. Dad was awake instantly, moving with a speed I wouldn't have thought possible. I followed him out of the tent, the shotgun raised and ready. Nothing in my life, nothing in all the stories I'd heard or all the warnings we'd received, could have prepared me for what we saw. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted white fur that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But it was the details that turned my blood to ice. It stood on 2 legs like a man, but they were wrong. Too long, too jointed. Horns curved up from its skull, not like a goat's horns, but like something older, something that horns had been modeled after. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed red, not with reflected light, but with their own inner fire. They weren't animal eyes or even human eyes. They were something else, something that knew things, ancient things, terrible things. The creature was holding Uncle Marcus by the throat, lifting him as easily as I might lift a kitten. Marcus's feet dangled a foot off the ground, his hands clawing uselessly at the thing's arm. I didn't think. I couldn't think. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast caught the creature in the leg. It jerked back, a surprisingly human gesture, and dropped Uncle Marcus. Then it turned those burning eyes on me, and I heard its voice. The sound bypassed my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind like a nightmare-given voice. I can't remember the exact words it spoke, but I remember the feeling they gave me. Like I was a mouse that had caught the attention of an owl. Like I was something small and insignificant that had suddenly become prey. I fired again, the second barrel catching the creature in its chest. Dark liquid that I refused to call blood sprayed from the wound, and the thing retreated into the forest with a movement that was too smooth, too purposeful to be natural. We spent the rest of the night huddled in one tent, weapons ready, jumping at every sound. Uncle Marcus's neck was badly bruised, and he couldn't speak above a whisper. Dad kept checking the wounds he'd seen me inflict on the creature, as if confirming to himself that it had been real, that something could be hurt by ordinary shot and powder. When dawn finally came, we packed with frantic speed and practically ran back to the truck. The return journey was a blur of terror and exhaustion. Every shadow might have been the creature, every sound might have been its approach. We didn't speak, couldn't speak. What was there to say about what we'd seen? The nightmares started that very night. In them I always see those eyes, feel that voice in my mind. I wake up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat, the smell of rotting eggs and meat lingering in my nostrils. I stopped going to school for a while. How could I sit in a classroom learning about math and history when I knew what was out there? I became obsessed with research, spending countless hours online and in libraries, looking for similar encounters. I found more than I expected. Stories from all over the world about creatures that walked like men but weren't men. About things in the forest that spoke with human voices. The term goat man kept coming up, but that didn't seem right. What we'd seen was older than any modern legend, older than the words we use to describe such things. 2 weeks after our encounter, we visited my aunt and uncle's countryside home, about 3 hours from where we lived. Their property covered 5 acres of woodland, well lit with solar-powered LEDs that created a false sense of security. That night, exhausted from traveling, I went to bed early. The room was dark, and I didn't bother with the light. I heard the door open at some point but assumed it was one of my cousins coming in to sleep. For hours I shared that room with something that wasn't human. It sat in the darkness, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel. When my cousin Mario finally came in and turned on the light, we both saw it. The same creature from the forest, sitting in a chair by my bed as casually as a parent watching over a sleeping child. The way it moved when it realized it had been discovered. That's what haunts me most now. It stood with terrible grace, walked to the window with perfectly human strides, and descended into the darkness below. We watched it disappear into the woods, moving with a purpose that suggested it knew exactly where it was going and what it would do when it got there. Years have passed since those encounters, but their impact remains. I still love nature, still feel drawn to the forest, but now I understand what my father meant about beauty and danger being 2 sides of the same coin. I understand why the old stories were only told at night, why some paths are marked with warnings in languages too old to read. Uncle Marcus recovered from his physical injuries, but he never went back to being a ranger. He gave me the map before he left Jamaica, moving to a city where the trees are few and the forests are far away. I keep it locked away now, but sometimes I take it out and study those ancient symbols, trying to understand what they were trying to warn us about. Dad still works as a ranger, but he stays in the safe areas now, the places where tourists go. He doesn't tell stories anymore, at least not the old ones about things in the deep forest. When people ask him why certain areas are off limits, he gives them official explanations about endangered species or unstable terrain. As for me, I've learned to live with what I know. The nightmares come less frequently now, but they haven't stopped entirely. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, I think about what might have happened if Mario hadn't turned on that light. And I wonder if somewhere in the Jamaican wilderness, something with red eyes and human hands is thinking about me too. But mostly, I think about why we were there in the first place, about a 14-year-old kid who thought he knew everything about the forest because he could name the trees and track the animals. I think about how some knowledge comes at a terrible price, and how some questions are better left unasked. Because the forest has old magic, older than nations, older than names. And sometimes when you go looking for stories, the stories come looking for you instead. Growing up in rural Shreve, Ohio means learning early that civilization is just a thin veneer over something older and wilder. Our 2 acres sat like an island in a vast sea of farmland and forest, nearly 1,500 acres of territory that belonged more to nature than to man. From my earliest memories, I understood that our property wasn't truly ours. We were just borrowing it from whatever had been there first. My parents were practical people. Dad worked construction. Mom taught at the local elementary school. But they had a deep respect for the land that went beyond the usual farmer's pragmatism. They taught me to read the weather in cloud patterns, to identify every bird call, to understand the complex language of the forest. "The woods are always talking," my father would say, "but most folks have forgotten how to listen." I was an only child, but I never felt lonely. The forest was my playground, my classroom, and my constant companion. I spent countless hours exploring the winding deer trails, building forts from fallen branches, and learning the rhythms of the wild. By age 10, I could tell you which tracks belonged to which animals, how old they were, and which direction they were heading. I knew where the owls nested, where the foxes denned, and which parts of the stream held the biggest crawdads. My mother worried sometimes about how much time I spent in the woods alone. "Nature isn't always kind," she'd warn, but I never felt afraid. The forest felt more like home than our actual house sometimes. Looking back now, I wonder if that comfort wasn't just childhood naivete. Maybe there are good reasons why humans decided to build walls and light fires to keep the darkness at bay. I met B in 6th grade, when his family moved to Shreve from Cincinnati. He stood out immediately, a city kid who wore skateboarding shoes and had actually been to concerts. But underneath the urban exterior, B had the same wild spark I did. He was the first person I met who didn't think it was weird to spend hours tracking deer just to see where they went, or to sit perfectly still in the growing darkness listening to the night wake up. We bonded over skateboarding first. Our rural town didn't have much in the way of skate parks, so we built our own ramps and rails, testing them out in my driveway until the sun set. But it was the woods that really cemented our friendship. B took to outdoor life like he'd been born to it. He had an almost uncanny ability to spot animal signs I missed, and his night vision was incredible. "It's because city folks never see real darkness," he explained once. "Out here, your eyes learn to work differently." Over the next few years, B and I became inseparable. We pushed each other to explore further, stay out later, venture deeper into the wilderness that surrounded us. We mapped the forgotten corners of those 1,500 acres in our minds, discovering old foundations from long-abandoned farmhouses, strange rock formations that looked almost man-made, and deer trails so ancient they'd worn feet-deep grooves into the earth. We also started noticing things that didn't quite make sense. Tracks that didn't match any animal we knew. Strange sounds in the deep night that didn't fit any natural pattern. Areas where the wildlife seemed to go quiet for no reason. We dismissed most of it as imagination or coincidence. The woods can play tricks on your mind after all. But there were moments, brief, unsettling moments, when we'd look at each other and know we'd both experienced something we couldn't explain. Like the time we found a perfect circle of dead vegetation, 30 feet across with no obvious cause. Or the afternoon we tracked what we thought was a wounded deer, only to have the track suddenly stop in the middle of soft mud, as if the animal had simply vanished. Looking back, I wonder if these weren't warnings, the forest trying to tell us something we were too young and too confident to understand. The summer of 2009 felt different from the start. I was 15, caught in that strange space between childhood and adulthood, where everything seems both incredibly significant and utterly confusing. The woods that had always been my refuge started feeling different. Not exactly threatening, but less familiar somehow, as if the trees themselves had shifted slightly when I wasn't looking. The wildlife patterns changed too. The deer started avoiding certain areas they'd always frequented. The coyotes became more vocal but less visible. Even the birds seemed to alter their behavior, going quiet at odd times during the day. B noticed it too. "Something's off," he said one afternoon in late July, as we sat on a fallen log, watching the sun filter through the leaves. "It's like everything's waiting for something to happen." I knew exactly what he meant. There was a tension in the air that summer, like the feeling just before a massive thunderstorm. But this storm never seemed to break. We started hearing stories from around town, livestock acting strange, pets going missing, people seeing shapes moving at the edges of their fields at dusk. Most folks blamed it on coyotes or the occasional black bear that wandered down from the north. But the explanations felt hollow somehow, like when adults tell children there's nothing under the bed without checking themselves. My parents noticed the change too, though they tried to hide it. I caught them having whispered conversations on the porch at night, going quiet when I came outside. Mom started forgetting to hang laundry if it wouldn't be dry before sunset. Dad installed extra security lights around the property and started keeping our dog Max inside after dark, something he'd never done before. When I asked about it, they brushed it off with vague explanations about coyotes being more aggressive that year. But I saw the way they watched the tree line at dusk, and how they always seemed to know exactly where I was when I was outside. Bee's family was less subtle. His mom started explicitly forbidding him from going into the woods alone, something she'd never cared about before. His dad bought a new shotgun. For hunting, he said, but Bee told me he'd seen him loading it with rounds that looked different from regular ammunition. By mid-August, the tension had become almost unbearable. The humidity hung thick in the air, making every breath feel heavy. The corn in the surrounding fields had grown head-high, creating walls of green that seemed to trap sound in unnatural ways. You could be 20 feet from someone and not hear them calling. That last week of August, things escalated. It started with small incidents that were easy to dismiss individually, but formed a disturbing pattern when viewed together. On Monday, we found Max barking at the woods from our back porch, his hackles raised and his tail tucked, something I'd never seen from our normally confident lab. He refused to come down from the porch until well after sunrise. Tuesday, all the neighborhood dogs started howling in unison around midnight. Not barking, howling like wolves, all facing the same direction. It lasted for exactly 17 minutes, I timed it, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. Wednesday, Bee and I were skating in my driveway when we noticed something odd about the cornfield across the road. A section about 20 feet wide was bent over, all the stalks pushed in the same direction as if something large had moved through them. But there was no trail leading to or from the damaged area. Just that one section, like something had dropped from the sky. Thursday brought the dead animals. First, we found a rabbit on my front lawn, completely intact but twisted into an unnatural position. Later that day, 3 more appeared along the edge of the woods. None showed any signs of predator damage. They looked like they'd simply died from fright. Friday was the day everything changed. It started normally enough. Bee came over after dinner bringing his skateboard and a new video he wanted to show me. We'd been planning this camp out all week, partly because the weather was finally cooling off, but mostly because we felt like we needed to prove something to ourselves. Looking back, I think we both knew something was coming. We just didn't know what. The evening began innocently enough. We set up our tent in the usual spot, about 50 yards from my house, close enough to see the porch light, far enough to feel like real camping. The air was unusually still, and the sunset painted the sky in shades of red that seemed too intense to be natural. "Red sky at night, sailor's delight," Bee quoted, but his voice lacked conviction. We got the tent up just as the last light faded, our movements practiced from countless similar nights. The familiar Coleman tent, weathered but reliable, seemed somehow flimsier than usual against the gathering darkness. We threw our sleeping bags inside, set up Bee's laptop for videos, and tried to pretend everything was normal. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We watched skateboarding videos, shared a bag of Doritos, and talked about nothing in particular. The night sounds were typical at first: crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of a great horned owl. The coyotes started up around 10, their yips and howls echoing across the fields. This was normal, We heard them almost every night. What wasn't normal was how they sounded. Their calls seemed more frantic than usual, almost desperate. "They sound scared," B said, voicing what I was thinking. Then came the silence. Not gradual, like animals naturally going quiet, but sudden and complete. The coyotes cut off mid-howl. The crickets stopped all at once. Even the light breeze that had been rustling the corn seemed to die. The silence was absolute in a way that felt impossible. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. We could hear our own breathing, the blood rushing in our ears, the subtle creak of the tent material, and nothing else. "What the hell?" B whispered, though there was no real reason to lower his voice. That's when we heard it, the sound of something large moving through the grass outside our tent. The footfalls were deliberate, measured, like something trying to move quietly but too heavy to completely succeed. They circled the tent once, twice, 3 times, each circuit drawing slightly closer. Then came the sniffing, deep, powerful inhalations that reminded me of a dog tracking a scent, but wrong somehow. Too powerful, too purposeful. The sound carried an intelligence that no animal should possess. We sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as the thing outside continued its circuit. The laptop screen cast a pale blue glow that seemed to make the shadows darker. In that dim light, I could see the terror on B's face, knowing it matched my own. The hand came next. It pressed against the tent wall slowly, deliberately. In the ambient light from the house, we could see each finger distinctly through the nylon. It was unmistakably a hand, but everything about it was wrong. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at impossible angles. The skin looked like tree bark, dark and rough, with deep cracks that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. B reached slowly for the hammer we'd used to drive in the tent stakes. His movements were careful, measured, as if he was underwater. The hand remained pressed against the tent wall, fingers splaying and contracting in a grotesque parody of human movement. Then the creature began trying to force its way under the tent. The floor rippled as something massive pushed against it, accompanied by a sound that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a laugh, but somehow managed to suggest both while being fundamentally wrong. The sound seemed to resonate at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. B struck first, bringing the hammer down hard where the thing was pushing up through the floor. The impact made a dull thud that seemed to hold no echo. Instead of retreating or crying out in pain, the creature's response was to deepen its not-quite growl into something that sounded like it had crawled out of humanity's oldest nightmares. "Run!" B's shout broke whatever paralysis had held us. We burst through the tent door, abandoning everything except the hammer B still gripped. The yard that I'd known all my life had transformed into an alien landscape of shadows and half-seen movements. The distance to the garage, barely 50 yards, stretched out like miles. The porch light that had always been our beacon of safety now seemed to cast more shadows than illumination, creating dancing patterns that made it impossible to trust our eyes. Behind us, something followed. I could hear it moving, not running exactly, but covering ground with terrible efficiency. Each time I glanced back, I caught glimpses of something that my mind refused to fully process. A shape that seemed to flow across the ground more than run, its outline constantly shifting and changing. Sometimes it seemed to move on 4 legs, sometimes on 2, sometimes in ways that defied any natural locomotion. The sound it made as it pursued us defied description. It was like hearing a wolf's growl played backwards and slowed down, overlaid with something that might have been human speech but wasn't. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the thing behind us was somehow surrounding us, even as we could see it following. B kept pace beside me, his breathing ragged with terror. The hammer in his hand caught occasional glints of light, reminding me of how pathetically inadequate our defenses were against whatever was behind us. We reached the garage door after what felt like hours but must have been seconds. My hand shook so badly I could barely work the latch. B turned to face what pursued us, the hammer raised in trembling hands. "Don't look at it," he gasped. "Don't. It's not." His warning cut off in a strangled sound that made me turn despite myself. What I saw in that moment has haunted my nightmares ever since. The thing that stood at the edge of the light was wrong. It seemed to be made of shadows that hadn't learned how to behave properly, its form suggesting both wolf and human while being neither. Its eyes reflected the porch light like an animal's, but there were too many of them, and they moved independently of each other. We slammed the garage door shut and huddled inside, surrounded by the familiar shapes of lawn equipment and storage boxes that suddenly seemed strange and threatening in the darkness. Every sound, the settling of the house, the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the ticking of cooling metal, made us jump. The thing outside didn't leave immediately. We could hear it moving around the garage, its footfalls changing rhythm and weight as if it couldn't decide what form to take. Occasionally it would press against the walls, making the entire structure creak. The sound it made had changed, no longer the growl laugh, but something that sounded almost like words spoken in a language too old for human tongues. We stayed there until dawn, neither of us willing to move or speak. As the sky began to lighten, the sounds outside gradually faded. Even after they stopped completely, we waited another hour before daring to open the door. The morning light revealed a scene that defied rational explanation. Our tent was shredded, the fabric torn in long strips that couldn't have been made by any normal claws. The ground around it showed signs of something massive having thrashed about, but the tracks made no sense. They started as what might have been wolf prints, but too large and with too many toes. As they approached the garage, they changed. Some looked almost human, others defied classification entirely. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to shift mid-stride, as if whatever made them was constantly changing shape as it moved. The grass where the thing had walked was dead, not trampled but withered and gray as if all life had been drained from it. These dead patches formed a path that led to the edge of the woods and stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. The immediate impact of that night was profound. I developed an intense fear of darkness that I'd never had before. Even inside my house, with doors locked and lights on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep became almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shifting form at the edge of the light, those too many eyes reflecting the porch light. B and I didn't talk about what happened for weeks. When we finally did, we found our memories matched perfectly, down to the smallest details about the hand's appearance and the way the creature's form seemed to constantly shift. This shared experience made it impossible to dismiss as imagination or hysteria. My parents noticed the change in me, though I never told them exactly what happened. How could I? But they saw how I no longer went into the woods, how I insisted on keeping my bedroom windows closed even on hot nights, how I jumped at unexpected sounds. The physical evidence remained as well. The dead patches in the grass never recovered. Nothing would grow there, not even weeds. Our dog Max refused to go near that part of the yard, and birds seemed to avoid flying over it. The tent remained where it had fallen, neither of us willing to go near it. When my father finally went to clean it up, he came back looking shaken, though he wouldn't say why. The experience drove me to obsessive research. I spent months in the local library, reading everything I could find about local history and folklore. I discovered that the area had a long history of strange occurrences. Native American legends spoke of shape-shifting beings that haunted these lands. Early settlers' accounts mentioned unexplained phenomena similar to what we'd experienced. I found records of similar incidents throughout the region's history. In 1876, a farmer reported losing an entire herd of sheep to something that walked like a man but moved like a wolf. In 1923, 3 children described seeing a big, dark thing with too many eyes at the edge of their school playground. In 1957, a hunter disappeared in the woods, leaving only tracks that seemed to change from human to animal and back. Throughout the 1980s, multiple residents reported hearing sounds that seemed to mix animal calls with human speech. The term skinwalker kept appearing in my research, though we were far from the Navajo territories where these legends originated. Other cultures had similar beings in their folklore, shapeshifters that straddled the line between human and animal, natural and supernatural. Over the years, I've heard other stories from people in the area, whispered accounts of similar encounters. Each tale shares common elements: the unnatural silence, the mixture of human and animal characteristics, the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. A farmer 3 miles down the road described finding his cattle arranged in a perfect circle one morning, all facing inward, none willing to move. A teenage girl reported seeing something following her home from school, something that looked like a person until it didn't. An old man who'd lived in the area his whole life told me about the night in 1962 when all the dogs in town howled for hours at something only they could see. Bea and I stayed friends, bound by our shared experience, but our relationship changed. We never camped out again, never went into the woods at night. We couldn't even skateboard in the driveway after sunset without feeling exposed and vulnerable. 15 years have passed since that night, but its effects linger. I still live in Ohio, but not in Shreve. I couldn't stay there, knowing what lurked in those woods. I've learned to function normally for the most part, but certain things still trigger the memories. The sound of wind in trees at night, the sight of 2 large tracks in soft earth, the way shadows sometimes seem to move against the light. Bea moved to California after college, as far from Ohio forests as he could get. We stay in touch, texting regularly and calling each other when the memories become too heavy to bear alone. Neither of us has ever encountered anything similar again, but we both know it's out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes I dream about that night, but the dreams have changed over the years. They're no longer just memories of terror. They've evolved into something more complex. In these dreams, I understand that what we encountered wasn't evil exactly, just fundamentally different from anything human beings were meant to comprehend. It operated according to laws and purposes we couldn't understand, existing in a world that overlapped with ours but wasn't bound by our rules of reality. I still return to Shreve occasionally to visit family. The town has grown, with new housing developments encroaching on the old farmland, but those 1,500 acres of woods remain largely unchanged, a dark presence at the edge of civilization. When I drive past my old house, I always keep my eyes straight ahead, resisting the urge to look at the spot where our tent once stood. But in my peripheral vision, I sometimes catch glimpses of movement among the trees, shapes that don't quite match any natural animal, shadows that move against the wind. The experience left me with a profound understanding that the world is larger and stranger than we like to admit. There are things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, things that defy our attempts at classification or explanation. I've never gone camping again, never learned to fully trust the darkness, but I've also never lost the certainty that somewhere in those woods, something ancient and other still walks, neither fully animal nor human, neither fully natural nor supernatural. It walks the boundary between what we understand and what we sense but cannot comprehend. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the wind drops and the world holds its breath, I swear I can still hear that sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a laugh, echoing from the dark spaces between the trees. My name is Nolan Brackett, and this is the story of how my life, and the lives of everyone in our small town of Cayuga, changed forever. It was the summer of 2011, a time that should have been filled with the laughter of children on vacation and the buzz of lawnmowers on lazy Saturday mornings. Instead, it became a season of fear, suspicion, and loss that would haunt us for years to come. I've been a police officer in Cayuga for 15 years. It's a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where doors are left unlocked at night, and where the biggest crime is usually a teenager swiping a six-pack from the corner store. At least, that's how it used to be. The day everything changed started like any other. I was at the station, nursing my third cup of coffee and trying to wake up properly. The night shift had been quiet, just a couple of noise complaints and a drunk who needed a ride home. Nothing out of the ordinary. My partner, Jake Stoddard, was at his desk across from mine. Jake was a rookie, fresh out of the academy with an earnest face and a perpetual look of enthusiasm that sometimes grated on my nerves. But he was a good kid, and he had a knack for lightening the mood with his terrible jokes. "Hey, Nolan," Jake said, looking up from a stack of paperwork. "Did you hear about old man Dunleavy's missing goats again? He thinks aliens took them this time." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Aliens, huh? Maybe Bigfoot gave them a lift. You know, I'm starting to think Dunleavy's missing goats are just wandering off because they're tired of his conspiracy theories." Jake was about to respond with what I'm sure would have been another groan-worthy quip when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting another call about a lost dog or a noise complaint from Mrs. Henderson about the Thompson kids' rock band practice. "Cayuga Police Department, Officer Brackett speaking." The voice on the other end was trembling, thick with worry. "Nolan, it's Margaret Vance. You gotta come quick. It's my daughter Emily. She didn't come home last night." I felt a chill run down my spine. Emily Vance was a good kid. 17 years old, smart as a whip, always respectful. She was the kind of teenager who made you think maybe the next generation wasn't going to hell in a handbasket after all. It wasn't like her to disappear. "Okay, Margaret, calm down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're on our way. Don't touch anything in Emily's room, all right? We'll be there soon." I hung up and turned to Jake. "We've got a missing person. Emily Vance didn't come home last night." Jake's eyes widened. "Emily? But she's not the type to—" "I know," I cut him off. "That's why we're going now. Come on." We jumped into the cruiser and sped to the Vance residence, a modest two-story house on Elm Street. The summer heat was already building, the air thick and heavy with humidity. As we pulled up, I saw Margaret pacing on the front porch, her face pale and drawn with fear. She rushed down the steps as we got out of the car. "Nolan, Jake, thank God you're here. I don't know what to do. Emily's never done anything like this before." "Let's go inside, Margaret," I said gently, guiding her back to the house. "Tell us everything you know." Once we were seated in the living room, Margaret took a deep breath and began. She was at the library studying for her finals. She texted me around 8 p.m., said she was coming home, but she never did. I stayed up waiting, thinking maybe she'd lost track of time with her friends, but when she wasn't here this morning— Her voice trailed off, and she buried her face in her hands. Jake leaned forward, his voice soft. "Mrs. Vance, did Emily mention meeting anyone? Any plans after studying?" Margaret shook her head. "No, nothing. She was so focused on her exams. She wouldn't have gone off without telling me, especially not on a school night." I nodded, my mind already racing through possibilities. "Okay, Margaret. We're going to need to look at Emily's room, and we'll need her phone records. Can you call the phone company and authorize them to release that information to us?" As Margaret went to make the call, Jake and I headed upstairs to Emily's room. It was neat and tidy, posters of bands I'd never heard of on the walls, a desk piled high with textbooks and notebooks. Nothing seemed out of place, no sign of a struggle or hasty packing. "What do you think, Nolan?" Jake asked, his voice low. I shook my head. "I don't know, kid. but I've got a bad feeling about this. Let's hope we're wrong. We spent the next hour combing through Emily's room, looking for any clue that might tell us where she'd gone. We found her diary, but it revealed nothing more than the usual teenage concerns: stress about exams, gossip about friends, a crush on a boy in her English class. Nothing to suggest she was planning to run away or meet someone in secret. As we were finishing up, Margaret called us back downstairs. She'd gotten the phone records, and there was something odd. The last message Emily received was from an unknown number. The content was cryptic. "Meet me at the old mill." The old mill, a derelict building on the outskirts of town, a place kids sometimes went to for a thrill or to make out away from prying eyes. It had been abandoned for years, deemed unsafe by the town council, but that hadn't stopped it from becoming a local hangout spot. Jake and I exchanged a look. We both knew we had to check it out. "Margaret," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "we're going to head to the old mill to take a look. I want you to stay here in case Emily comes home or tries to contact you. Can you do that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "You'll call me if you find anything, right?" "Of course," I assured her. "We'll let you know as soon as we know anything." As we headed back to the cruiser, I could feel the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. In 15 years on the force, we'd had our share of missing persons, but they were usually drunks who'd wandered off or kids who'd run away after a fight with their parents. They almost always turned up within a day or two, sheepish and apologetic. But this felt different. Emily wasn't the type to disappear without a word, and that cryptic text message set off every alarm bell in my head. Jake must have sensed my unease. "We'll find her, Nolan," he said as we pulled away from the Vance house. "She's probably just lost track of time with some friends." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I wanted to believe him, but years on the job had taught me that hope could be a dangerous thing. Sometimes the worst-case scenario was exactly what you found. As we drove towards the old mill, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. The old building loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes staring out at us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and for a moment I wished I'd called for backup, but there was no time for that now. If Emily was here, we needed to find her. And if she wasn't, well, we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. I parked the cruiser a little way from the mill, not wanting to announce our presence if anyone was inside. Jake and I got out, flashlights in hand, and approached the building cautiously. The door hung off its hinges, creaking ominously in the light evening breeze. I signaled to Jake to stay close as we entered, our flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. The air inside was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. Our footsteps echoed on the bare concrete floor, every sound seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Emily?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls. "Emily Vance? It's Officer Brackett. Are you here?" No response, just the hollow echo of my own voice coming back to me. We moved deeper into the building, checking every corner, every shadowy recess. The beam of my flashlight caught something near the back of the room, a splash of color against the drab gray of the concrete. My heart sank as I approached. It was Emily's backpack, her books strewn about as if dropped in a hurry, but there was no sign of Emily herself. "Jake," I called, my voice tight. "Over here." He joined me, his face paling as he saw the backpack. "Jesus, Nolan, what do you think happened?" I shook my head, trying to keep my professional demeanor even as a cold dread settled in my stomach. "I don't know. But we need to call this in. This is a crime scene now." As Jake radioed for backup and forensics, I continued to search the area around the backpack. That's when I saw it. A small, dark stain on the concrete. I leaned in closer, my flashlight illuminating it clearly. Blood. In that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. Something terrible had happened to Emily Vance, and it was up to us to figure out what. As we waited for backup to arrive, I stood in the empty mill, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily on my shoulders. The peaceful summer I had been looking forward to had just turned into a nightmare, and I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Little did I know then just how deep this case would go, or how it would change not only my life but the very fabric of our small town. The shadows that had always lurked at the edges of Cayuga were about to step into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The shadows that had always lurked at the edges of Cayuga were about to step into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next few days were a blur of activity. The mill had been cordoned off, forensics teams combing every inch for evidence. Emily's backpack and the bloodstain were our only solid leads, and they painted a grim picture. I'd had to break the news to Margaret that we'd found evidence suggesting foul play. The look on her face as the realization hit her is something that will haunt me for the rest of my days. No parent should ever have to hear those words about their child. The whole town was on edge. Cayuga had always been the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played in the streets until dark. Now an eerie quiet had settled over the community. Parents kept their children close, and suspicious glances were cast at strangers and neighbors alike. Jake and I threw ourselves into the investigation, working around the clock. We interviewed everyone who had seen Emily in the days leading up to her disappearance. The librarian, Mrs. Dunbar, remembered seeing Emily leave around 7:30 p.m. on the night she vanished. She seemed in good spirits, Mrs. Dunbar told us, her brow furrowed with concern. Said she was meeting a friend for coffee before heading home. That led us to the local coffee shop, a popular hangout for teens. The barista, Sam, a lanky guy with a permanent smirk, confirmed he'd seen Emily that night. "Yeah, she was here with Lucas," Sam said, wiping down the counter. "They left together around 8, I think." Lucas, Emily's friend and study partner. We tracked him down at his home, a nervous, lanky kid with a habit of biting his nails. He seemed genuinely distraught about Emily's disappearance. "We were studying together," Lucas said, his eyes darting nervously. "But then she got a text and said she had to meet someone. I offered to go with her, but she said it was fine. I should have insisted. It's not your fault, Lucas," I reassured him, even as I made a mental note of his behavior. In cases like these, you can never rule anyone out. "Did Emily say who she was meeting?" Lucas shook his head. "No, she just said she had to go. I thought maybe it was her mom or something." We dug deeper into Emily's phone records, tracing the unknown number that had sent the text about the old mill. It led us to a burner phone, purchased at a convenience store in town. The surveillance footage showed a man in a hoodie, his face obscured, buying the phone. It wasn't much, but it was something. As we expanded our investigation, a name surfaced: Harold Gibbons. He was a drifter with a history of petty crimes who had been in and out of Cayuga over the past few months, doing odd jobs and keeping to himself. No one had paid him much attention, but now he was our prime suspect. Jake and I tracked Gibbons down to a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. When we knocked on his door, he opened it a crack, his eyes darting suspiciously. "Harold Gibbons?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving towards my holster. "Yeah, who's asking?" His voice was gruff, hostile. "Officer Brackett and Officer Stoddard. We need to ask you a few questions." His eyes widened, and he tried to slam the door, but we were ready for it. We pushed through, and Gibbons fought like a cornered animal. It took both of us to subdue him, but we finally got him cuffed and into the cruiser. Back at the station, Gibbons clammed up, refusing to talk without a lawyer. But the evidence was mounting. His fingerprints were on Emily's backpack, and DNA analysis linked him to the blood found at the scene. It seemed like we had our man. Days turned into weeks as we built our case against Gibbons. The town held its breath, hoping for closure but dreading the final revelation of Emily's fate. Margaret Vance was a shell of her former self, her eyes hollow with grief and uncertainty. Finally, after weeks of interrogation and mounting evidence, Gibbons broke. His confession was chilling in its banality. "I just wanted to rob her," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. But she struggled and I panicked. I didn't mean to kill her." Gibbons led us to where he had hidden Emily's body, deep in the woods outside of town. The scene was grim, the kind that sticks with you no matter how many years you've been on the force. Emily had been strangled, her young life snuffed out in an act of senseless violence. We arrested Gibbons for Emily's murder, and the town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster had been caught, justice would be served. But the scars remained, and Cayuga would never be the same. The trial was a somber affair. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as the proceedings unfolded. Gibbons was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It should have felt like a victory, but as I watched Margaret Vance's tearful reaction to the verdict, I knew that no punishment could ever truly bring justice for what had been lost. In the months that followed, Cayuga tried to heal. The old mill, the site of Emily's last moments, was torn down. In its place, a memorial park was built, a place of reflection and remembrance. But the shadows of what had happened lingered over the town like a heavy cloud. I threw myself into my work, determined to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. Jake, shaken by his first major case, became more serious. The spark of youthful optimism dimmed in his eyes. We made a good team, more in sync now that we had been through the fire together. But something nagged at me, a doubt I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried to push it away. It was nothing concrete, just a feeling that we had missed something, that the pieces fit together a little too neatly. I found myself revisiting the case files late at night, poring over every detail. Jake noticed my obsession and tried to talk me out of it. "We got him, Nolan," he'd say, concern evident in his voice. "It's over. You need to let it go." But I couldn't. And as it turned out, I was right not to. It was almost a year after Emily's murder when the breakthrough came. I was at my desk, nursing a cold cup of coffee, and leafing through the files for the 100th time when Jake burst in, his face pale. "Nolan, you need to see this," he said, dropping a file on my desk. "There's been another murder, 2 towns over, the M.O. It's identical to Emily's case." My blood ran cold as I scanned the report. A young woman lured to an abandoned building by a text message, strangled and left in the woods. It was like history, repeating itself. "But Gibbons is in prison," I said, my mind racing. "This can't be him." Jake nodded grimly. "Exactly. What if we got the wrong guy?" The implications were staggering. If we had been wrong about Gibbons, it meant the real killer was still out there. It meant we had failed Emily, failed Margaret, failed the entire town of Cayuga. We reopened the investigation, this time looking beyond Gibbons, beyond the easy answers we had accepted before. We dug deeper into Emily's life, her relationships, her online presence, and slowly a new picture began to emerge. There was a name that kept coming up, someone who had been on the periphery of our initial investigation, but who we had dismissed. Victor Harlan. He had worked odd jobs around town, including at the library where Emily studied. He had left Cayuga shortly after Emily was found, which hadn't seemed suspicious at the time. Drifters came and went all the time. But now, with fresh eyes and new information, we saw the connections we had missed before. Victor had a history of violence, a record that stretched across several states. He was known for targeting vulnerable young women, luring them with charm and false promises. We tracked Victor to a small town in Pennsylvania, working with local authorities to bring him in for questioning. It didn't take long for him to crack under pressure. His confession was even more chilling than Gibbons. Victor had orchestrated the whole thing, using Gibbons as an unwitting accomplice and then as a scapegoat. He had cultivated a friendship with Emily, gaining her trust over time. The text message, the meeting at the mill, it had all been his plan. Gibbons had merely been a pawn, manipulated into taking the fall. The revelation hit Cayuga like a thunderbolt. Emily's case was reopened, and Victor was charged with her murder, along with the murders of several other young women across multiple states. Gibbons, while not innocent of involvement, had his sentence reduced in light of the new evidence. The second trial was even more painful than the first. Margaret Vance had to relive her daughter's death all over again, this time with the added anguish of knowing how close we had come to letting the real killer escape justice. The town was torn between relief that the true culprit had been caught and anger at the system that had failed them. As for me, the weight of our mistake bore down heavily. I had let my desire for a quick resolution blind me to the inconsistencies in the case. It was a failure I would have to live with for the rest of my career. But amidst the pain and recrimination, there was also a sense of closure. The real killer had been caught, and this time we were certain. Victor Harlan would never hurt anyone again. In the years that followed, Cayuga slowly began to heal. The memorial park became a place of solace rather than sorrow. Margaret Vance, though forever changed by her loss, found purpose in starting a support group for families of victims of violent crimes. Jake and I continued to work together, our bond strengthened by the trials we had faced. We became known for our thoroughness, our refusal to accept easy answers. The shadow of Emily's case hung over us, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the importance of our work. As for me, I found a measure of peace. The guilt never fully went away, but I channeled it into becoming a better cop, a better protector for our community. Every case, every investigation was a chance to honor Emily's memory by seeking the truth, no matter how difficult or complex it might be. Cayuga would never be the same town it was before that fateful summer. The innocence was gone, replaced by a wary vigilance. But there was strength there, too, a resilience born from facing the darkness and coming out the other side. As I sit on my porch now, years later, watching the sun set over the trees, I think about Emily, about Margaret, about Victor and Harold and all the lives touched by this tragedy. The scars are still there, but they've healed into something we can live with. We had faced the shadows that lurked in Cayuga, and though the battle had been costly, we had emerged stronger, not unscathed but unbroken. And in the end, that was enough. The summer breeze carries the laughter of children playing in the distance, a sound that once might have been taken for granted, but now feels like a precious gift. Cayuga is alive, moving forward but never forgetting. And as the last light fades from the sky, I raise my glass in a silent toast. To Emily, to justice, to the long, hard road of healing, and to the hope that by remembering the darkness we might better appreciate the light. The summer I turned 7 was unlike any other. Looking back now, nearly 2 decades later, I can still vividly recall the events that unfolded on our isolated farmhouse property. It was a time of innocence, curiosity, and an unexpected brush with something beyond my young understanding. Our farmhouse stood alone amidst vast fields and dense forests, miles from the nearest neighbor. The isolation never bothered me as a child. In fact, I reveled in the freedom it provided. With school out for the summer and both my parents working morning shifts, I had the run of the place to myself. That particular morning started like any other. I woke to the sound of my parents' old pickup truck rumbling down the gravel driveway, signaling the start of their workday. The house creaked and settled around me as I padded downstairs in my pajamas, the worn wooden floorboards cool beneath my bare feet. I made my way to the kitchen, drawn by the promise of the sugary cereal my mother usually frowned upon, but had begrudgingly allowed as a summer treat. As I poured myself a bowl, my eyes drifted to the large window overlooking the backyard and the tree line beyond. That's when I saw it. At first, my sleepy brain couldn't quite process what my eyes were telling it. There, about 50 yards from the house, half hidden in the shadow of a massive oak tree, was something that didn't belong. I abandoned my cereal and pressed my face against the cool glass, squinting to get a better look. The creature, for I was certain now that it was some kind of animal, was unlike anything I had ever seen before, in books or on TV. It was massive, easily the size of our old station wagon. Its body was hunched and muscular, reminiscent of the gargoyles I had seen in picture books about old European churches. The creature's back legs were spread wide, supporting its bulk, while its front limbs were closer together, almost touching. But it was the details that truly set it apart from any known animal. Its entire body was covered in a strange mix of short, coarse fur, like a bear's, and what looked like owl feathers. The effect was unsettling, a patchwork of textures that seemed to shift and change as the morning light played across its form. The head was what drew my attention most. It was disproportionately large, shaped roughly like a bear's, but with— was that a beak? I couldn't be sure from this distance. What I could see clearly, however, were its eyes. They were enormous, far larger than any animal's eyes had a right to be. But there was something off about them, something that sent a chill down my spine even as I struggled to understand what I was seeing. The eyes looked blurry, not in the sense that I couldn't see them clearly, but as if the eyes themselves were out of focus. They reminded me of the oil paintings my grandmother created, where the colors would run and blend together in strange ways. These eyes seemed to do the same, their edges indistinct and wavering. I stood there, transfixed, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The creature didn't move, its strange, blurry gaze seemingly fixed on some point in the middle distance. Despite its stillness, there was an undeniable sense of presence about it, of awareness, of potential energy waiting to be unleashed. A sudden urge to see it more clearly overcame my initial fear. I tore myself away from the window and raced to the front door, pausing only to slip on my rubber boots. As I burst onto the porch, the cool morning air hit me like a splash of water, fully waking me up. I scanned the tree line where I had seen the creature, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. But the spot under the old oak was empty. My shoulders slumped in disappointment, but then another idea struck me. My father's binoculars. He kept them on a high shelf in the mudroom, using them occasionally to spot deer or interesting birds. I darted back inside, dragging a chair from the kitchen to reach the shelf. The binoculars were heavy in my small hands, the leather strap worn smooth with use. Back on the porch, I raised the binoculars to my eyes, adjusting them as I'd seen my father do countless times. I swept them across the tree line, searching for any sign of the strange creature. But no matter how carefully I looked, there was nothing to be seen. Just the familiar trees, their leaves rustling gently in the morning breeze. Disappointment warred with curiosity inside me. Had I really seen it? The memory was so vivid, so unlike any dream I'd ever had. And yet, I lowered the binoculars, chewing my lip as I considered my next move. The smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to go back inside and call my parents, to tell them what I'd seen and let them handle it. But I was 7 years old, filled with the invincibility of youth and an insatiable curiosity about the world around me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was off the porch and heading towards the trees. As I approached the spot where I'd seen the creature, a strange stillness fell over the forest. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but with each step I took, the usual sounds of the woods, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, grew fainter. By the time I reached the old oak tree, An eerie silence had descended. I'd grown up surrounded by these woods. They were my playground, my retreat, a constant backdrop to my young life. And never, not once, had I experienced them like this. The forest was always alive with sound, a cacophony of life that ebbed and flowed but never truly ceased. This silence was unnatural, oppressive. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Despite the growing unease in the pit of my stomach, I pressed on. I circled the massive trunk of the oak, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, half expecting the creature to materialize at any moment. But there was nothing. No sign that anything larger than a squirrel had been here recently. I expanded my search, moving in ever-widening circles around the tree. I looked for broken branches, unusual tracks, tufts of that strange fur and feather coat, anything that might prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But the forest floor was undisturbed, the leaf litter showing only the familiar marks of deer and smaller woodland creatures. As the minutes ticked by and my search yielded nothing, doubt began to creep in. Had it all been a product of my imagination? Some half-remembered dream blending with the real world in those hazy moments between sleep and wakefulness? But no. The memory was too vivid, too detailed to be a mere figment of my imagination. I could still see those unsettling, blurry eyes in my mind's eye, could still feel the mixture of awe and fear that had coursed through me at the sight of the creature. I don't know how long I wandered the woods that morning, searching for something I was no longer sure existed. The sun had climbed high in the sky by the time I finally gave up, my stomach growling in protest of my missed breakfast. As I turned to head back to the house, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, but it was just a squirrel, chattering angrily at me from a nearby branch. The spell of silence had broken, I realized. The forest was coming back to life around me, filled once more with its usual symphony of sounds. The walk back to the house seemed to take forever, my mind racing with questions I had no answers for. What had I seen? Where had it gone? And why had the forest fallen so eerily silent? As I approached the farmhouse, I half expected to see my parents' truck in the driveway to find them worried sick about my disappearance. But the gravel drive was empty. I'd been gone for hours, but in the grand scheme of things, it hadn't been that long at all. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of my usual summer activities, but unable to shake the memory of what I'd seen. When my parents returned home that evening, tired from their long day at work, I found myself unable to tell them about the creature. It wasn't that I thought they wouldn't believe me. My parents had always encouraged my curiosity and listened to my stories, no matter how fantastical. But something held me back, a feeling that this experience was mine alone, something precious and mysterious that would lose its power if shared. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the shadows on my ceiling, I made a decision. I would keep searching. I would find proof of what I'd seen, even if it took me years. Little did I know then how prophetic that childish determination would prove to be. The days that followed were filled with a feverish intensity. Every free moment I had was spent in the woods, searching for any sign of the creature's return. I became an amateur tracker, poring over books from the local library to learn how to identify animal signs and trails. My parents, amused and a little puzzled by my sudden interest in wildlife, encouraged my new hobby. They even bought me a disposable camera, which I carried everywhere in hopes of capturing evidence of my encounter. But as the weeks went by, my enthusiasm began to wane. The creature never reappeared, and my searches yielded nothing but an ever-growing knowledge of the local flora and fauna. By the time school started again in the fall, the incident had begun to take on a dreamlike quality in my mind. Had it really happened? Or had it been nothing more than the overactive imagination of a lonely child? Life moved on as it tends to do. I grew older, made friends, discovered new interests. The memory of that summer morning faded, pushed to the back of my mind by the everyday concerns of growing up. But it never truly left me. In quiet moments, when the world around me grew still, I would find myself thinking of those blurry, unsettling eyes and the silence that had fallen over the forest. As I entered my teenage years, my interest in the unexplained was rekindled. I devoured books on cryptozoology, folklore, and unexplained phenomena. I scoured the internet for similar sightings, joined online forums dedicated to the discussion of strange creatures. But nothing I found quite matched what I had seen that day. The closest I came was a series of local legends about a creature known as the Forest Guardian. According to these stories, passed down through generations of families in our rural area, the Guardian was a protector of the woods, appearing only in times of great ecological distress. Some described it as a massive, bear-like creature, while others swore it had the features of various birds of prey. None of the accounts mentioned the strange fur and feather coat or those haunting, blurry eyes, but the similarities were enough to keep me searching. As I grew older, my obsession with the creature began to affect my relationships. Friends and romantic partners found my continued belief in what I'd seen childish or even concerning. My parents, once supportive of my wildlife hobby, began to worry about the amount of time I spent researching and exploring the woods. They gently suggested that perhaps it was time to let go of childhood fantasies and focus on more practical pursuits. But I couldn't let it go. The memory of that encounter had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. It had instilled in me a deep respect for the mysteries of the natural world, a belief that there were things out there beyond our current understanding. This belief influenced my choice of studies in college, leading me to pursue a degree in environmental science with a focus on wildlife biology. My academic pursuits gave me new tools to approach my childhood experience. I learned about the complexities of ecosystems, the ways in which animals adapt to their environments, and the ongoing discoveries of new species in remote areas of the world. While none of this provided concrete answers about what I'd seen, it reinforced my belief that there was still much about our world that remained unknown. After college, I took a job with a wildlife conservation organization, which allowed me to spend much of my time in the field. I traveled to remote locations, studying endangered species and working to protect their habitats. All the while, I kept my eyes open for any sign of creatures that defied easy classification. It was during one of these expeditions, deep in an old-growth forest halfway across the country from my childhood home, that I had my second encounter. I was alone, having separated from my research team to investigate a series of unusual tracks we'd discovered earlier in the day. The forest around me was ancient, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. As I crouched to examine a particularly clear print in the soft earth, a familiar silence fell over the woods. My heart began to race as memories of that long-ago summer morning came flooding back. Slowly, carefully, I stood and turned in a circle, scanning the dense undergrowth for any sign of movement. There, partially obscured by a tangle of vines and ferns, I saw it. The creature from my childhood, unchanged by the passage of time. Its massive form was hunched in that same gargoyle-like posture, its strange coat of fur and feathers shifting in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy. And its eyes, those huge, blurry eyes, were fixed directly on me. For a long moment we stared at each other across the clearing. I felt none of the fear that had gripped me as a child, only a profound sense of awe and vindication. All these years, all the doubt and ridicule I'd endured, it had all been worth it for this moment. Slowly, moving with deliberate care, I reached for the camera hanging around my neck. But before I could raise it, the creature moved. It was faster than anything its size had any right to be, bounding away through the underbrush with impossible grace. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. The silence lingered for a few heartbeats more, and then the forest came alive again with its usual sounds. I stood there, camera forgotten in my hands, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until I heard the distant calls of my teammates that I snapped out of my daze. As I made my way back to our camp, my mind raced with questions. What was this creature? Why had it appeared to me again, after all these years? And what did its presence mean for our understanding of the natural world? I knew that without evidence, my sighting would be dismissed, just as my childhood experience had been. But I also knew that I couldn't keep this to myself. The world needed to know that there were still mysteries out there, still wonders waiting to be discovered. That night, as my teammates slept in their tents, I sat by the dying embers of our campfire and began to write. I wrote about my childhood encounter, about the years of searching and doubt that followed. I wrote about this new sighting, describing the creature in as much detail as I could remember. And I wrote about the questions it raised, the implications for our understanding of biodiversity and the need for conservation. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I didn't know if my account would be met with ridicule or curiosity, but I knew that I had to try. For that child who had stood on a farmhouse porch, binoculars in hand, searching for something he couldn't quite explain. For the adult who had never stopped believing, never stopped searching. And for the creature itself, whatever it might be, that had chosen to reveal itself to me not once, but twice in my lifetime. As I wrote, I made a promise to myself. I would continue my work, continue exploring and studying the hidden corners of our world. And maybe, just maybe, one day I would find the proof I needed to show the world that there were still wonders out there, waiting to be discovered. The oppressive Mississippi heat clung to my skin as I sat on my cousin Jake's porch, sipping sweet tea and listening to the cicadas' endless drone. It had been years since we'd seen each other, our lives taking different paths after high school. While I'd pursued a career in journalism, Jake had enlisted in the Mississippi National Guard, becoming a combat medic. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jake's demeanor changed. He set down his glass and leaned forward, his eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something happened during our last training exercise. Something I can't explain." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Jake had always been the pragmatic one, not given to flights of fancy or wild tales. Whatever had happened, it must have been significant to shake him like this. "Go on," I encouraged, reaching for my notepad out of habit. Jake took a deep breath and began his story. It had started as a routine training operation, he explained. 2 war platoons per company, 2 companies per team. Jake's group, Camp A, had set up northwest of Yellow Creek. The opposing force had established their position just south of a farm off Waynesboro's Shibuda, east of Waller's Ridge Road. "It was supposed to be a simple exercise," Jake said, shaking his head. "A mock battle to test our tactics and readiness, but it turned into something else entirely." The exercise had begun at midnight. Jake's platoon commander, Lieutenant Wilson, had decided to send out a reconnaissance group to scout for potential ambush positions and gather intelligence on the enemy's movements. Jake's squad had been chosen for the task. "We set out north, following some dirt trails," Jake continued. "We kept to the sides, though, in case we ran into an enemy patrol. By about 2:30 a.m., we were roughly 500 meters from the enemy camp. Jake's squad had found themselves skirting a marsh, which put them in clear sight of a power line cut through the woods. It was then that things took a turn for the bizarre. Our marksman, Private Hernandez, pulled out his binoculars to check if the way was clear," Jake said, his voice dropping even lower. "One second he was fine, the next he went white as a sheet and just froze." Sergeant Reeves had quickly pulled Hernandez back to the tree line, demanding to know what he'd seen. The young private had stammered something about seeing something down the line that ain't human. Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I've seen men scared before," he said. "Hell, I've been scared plenty of times myself." But the look on Hernandez's face, that was pure terror. Curiosity had gotten the better of the squad, and several others had decided to take a look for themselves. What they saw defied explanation. "They described it as this thing," Jake said, his eyes distant as if reliving the moment. 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in matted white or gray fur, with what looked like dried blood all over its chest. The creature's hind legs, Jake explained, were grotesquely deformed, incredibly long and slender, with knees that bent backwards. It had been standing out in the open, sniffing the air as if tracking something. Sergeant Reeves radioed the sighting into Company HQ, Jake continued. The response was immediate. "Get the hell out of there. Keep your heads down and keep off the roads. Get some live rounds and weapons free. The game is off." The squad had quickly retreated, but not before Hernandez, having regained some composure, checked again through his rifle scope. Jake's expression grew troubled as he recounted their return to Company HQ. "It was chaos," he said. Mounted patrol vehicles were storming around the camp. Spotlights swept the tree line. The comms were going crazy with reports of sightings in the woods. Another platoon had to be called in to secure the area. Jake fell silent for a moment, lost in thought. I waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. "The brass shut everything down after that," he finally continued. "No more training exercises for the rest of the month. We were given an official order to keep quiet about what happened. Don't tell anyone," they said, "not even family." I nodded slowly, processing the information. "But you're telling me," I pointed out. Jake met my eyes, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. "I had to tell someone," he said. "This, whatever it was, it's not something I can just forget about, and I think people need to know." I understood his position. As a journalist, I'd encountered my fair share of cover-ups and suppressed information. But this was different. This was personal. "What do you think it was?" I asked carefully. Jake shook his head. "I don't know for sure, but some of the guys, they started talking about legends, old stories. They called it a skinwalker. I'd heard of skinwalkers before, shape-shifting creatures from Native American folklore. But those were just stories, myths passed down through generations. Weren't they?" As the night deepened around us, Jake continued to share more details about the incident and its aftermath. The way the military had swooped in to contain the situation. The hushed conversations among the soldiers. The nightmares that had plagued many of them since that night. I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery, my journalistic instincts kicking into high gear. There was a story here, one that needed to be told. But I also knew the risks involved in pursuing it. The military didn't take kindly to leaked information, especially when it involved something as potentially explosive as this. Over the next few days, I stayed with Jake, using the time to gather as much information as I could. We pored over maps of the area, marking the locations Jake remembered from that night. I researched local legends and historical accounts, looking for any mention of similar creatures or sightings. As I delved deeper into the investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. More than once I caught glimpses of unfamiliar vehicles parked down the street, only to see them speed away when I tried to get a closer look. Jake grew increasingly nervous as the days passed. "Maybe we should just let this go," he said one evening, his voice tight with anxiety. "What if they find out I talked?" I understood his fear, but I couldn't let go of the story. It was too important, too potentially groundbreaking. "We'll be careful," I assured him. "No names, no specifics that could be traced back to you. But people need to know about this, Jake. If there's something out there—" He nodded reluctantly. and we continued our work. A week into my stay, I decided to visit the area where the sighting had occurred. Jake refused to go back, so I set out alone, armed with a camera, a voice recorder, and a growing sense of. The woods were thick and oppressive, the humidity making it difficult to breathe. As I followed the path Jake had described, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I reached the power line cut just as the sun was beginning to set. The clearing stretched out before me, a long, narrow gap in the dense forest. I could see why it would have provided a clear line of sight for Jake's squad. As I stood there taking photos and recording my observations, a sudden silence fell over the woods. The constant background noise of insects and birds simply stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct impression that I was no longer alone. Slowly I turned, scanning the tree line. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then, just at the edge of my vision, something moved. It was tall, far taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it was watching me. For a moment, we stood frozen, regarding each other across the clearing. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, it was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. As I sat there trying to catch my breath, I realized that my camera was gone. It must have fallen during my panicked flight through the woods. But the voice recorder was still in my pocket, and when I played it back later, beneath my heavy breathing and the sound of snapping twigs, there was something else. A low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I returned to Jake's house, shaken but more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the investigation, reaching out to contacts, digging through old records, and piecing together a pattern of similar sightings and encounters stretching back decades. But as I got closer to the truth, the pressure to back off intensified. Anonymous phone calls warned me to drop the story. My apartment was broken into, though nothing was taken. It became clear that someone, or something, didn't want this information to come to light. Jake, too, was feeling the heat. He called me one night, his voice tight with fear. "They know," he said. "They know I talked. I'm being reassigned, sent to a base halfway across the country. I think it's to keep me quiet." I tried to reassure him, but I could hear the resignation in his voice. He was pulling away, distancing himself from the story and from me. I couldn't blame him. He had a career, a life to protect. But I couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when I was so close. As the weeks turned into months, my investigation took me down increasingly dark paths. I uncovered reports of missing persons in the area stretching back years, many of them officially unsolved. I spoke with locals who shared stories passed down through generations, tales of creatures that walked like men but weren't men, of things that lurked in the deepest parts of the forest. But hard evidence remained elusive. Every time I thought I was close to a breakthrough, my leads would dry up. Sources would suddenly become unavailable. Data would mysteriously disappear from public records. It was clear that I was up against something bigger than I had initially realized. This wasn't just about one sighting in the woods. It was about a long-standing cover-up, a concerted effort to keep something hidden from the public eye. As I sit here now, putting the finishing touches on this account, I'm acutely aware of the risks involved in sharing this information. But I believe it's important that the truth, or at least as much of it as I've been able to uncover, be known. I don't know what Jake and his squad saw that night in the Mississippi woods. I don't know what I glimpsed in that clearing. But I do know that there are things in this world that defy conventional explanation, things that powerful forces would prefer to keep hidden. To those who would dismiss this as mere fantasy or the ramblings of an overactive imagination, I say this. Look closer. Ask questions. The truth is out there, hidden in the shadows of our world. And sometimes those shadows take on forms that challenge everything we think we know about reality.